My name's David Borger, and I've been asked by John Kirkman to say a few words about Dellwood and Granville and South Granville, in particular about public housing and also the Dellwood shops, public shopping that developed over many years. The Dellwood shops themselves were post-war housing, and they have a sort of cottage feel to them. They're sort of brick. They've got cantilevered awnings. They're like the shops you'd see in most neighbourhoods, but unlike most traditional town centres, they were built in one big lump by one developer, which was the government, and they have survived well. The government then eventually sold those shops over. They had units above them which still work really well. I think most people in the area really appreciate having shops close to home that they can walk to. They do a lot of walk-in traffic, and particularly because public housing tenants tend not to drive now. I mean, something like 95% of public housing tenants in New South Wales don't work anymore. When they were built, though, these were working class neighbourhoods. They were very different to the places they are now. Dellwood's interesting because Granville's a grid. It's a very long grid. It's a rare example of urban sprawl that was in a grid form, and it was a long way to get to the station. The public transport was not good. There were certainly some bus routes, so people needed to shop locally. So you'll find in Granville, corner shops actually survived much longer than they did in most other places. There's still remnants of corner shops being run by new traders from different migrant communities who live there. But Dellwood was really the centre of a proud little community around Dellwood, the epicentre of public housing. It was a really well-designed strip shop by the old Housing Commission, almost like a garden city sort of estate. Dellwood worked, and it continues to work really well, and people love that shopping precinct. It's a little neighbourhood with a park and a playground and shops that still trade really well, that survived, that's pretty safe, and really is a bit of a heart of the community there. Fibro housing was interesting because fibro was a cheap, durable and relatively efficient building material. It meant that when there was the great baby boom post the Second World War, governments and the private sector could go and build these houses en masse, cheaply, quickly and effectively. A lot of people actually, not all fibros in Granville were Housing Commission. A lot of people would get a set of homemade plans. They would build the garage, live in the garage, and whilst they were living in the garage, build a house, and the house would be built by a tradesman who actually then lived in the house. And of course there's another connection with fibros, because just down the road most of the fibro was actually produced in the James Hardie factory at Rose Hill, and there would have been many of the workers actually working in the factory. Of course later we found out just how terribly disastrous fibro was for people's health. Bernie Banton, who used to jag eels along the Parramatta River, actually worked in the James Hardie factory, and that's where he developed ultimately asbestosis. But the fibro houses were interesting. Back in the 80s, there was a view, I think, to romanticise them a bit. The council, and I was part of it, we actually heritage listed a couple of streets of fibro houses, and there was a great story in the Daily Telegraph. I don't know if everyone agreed with it, because of course living in a fibro house, it can be nice, but they're not the most thermally efficient buildings in the world. And more recently, fibros are being demolished, in particular by new migrant groups who probably see them as being too small, not nearly grandiose enough for the ambitions and aspirations of the new residents of Granville. And now we're seeing these very large houses, often with many people living in them, and they're being built cheek by jowl with the old fibro that's looking a bit sorry and sad these days. I mean, Granville is an interesting suburb, and it's not dissimilar to a lot of areas where there were big public housing estates. It was developed mainly after the Second World War. There was some development certainly before the war, but the back of the suburb really got moving post-World War II with the big baby boom, and people needed somewhere to live. My own grandparents had been living on the veranda of their neighbour's place in Empire Street, Haberfield, for 3 years, and they wanted to get into public housing because that was working housing, and there was a ballot, and they were in this ballot for 3 years, and their name didn't come up. They saw their local Labor MP, and then the next week their ball was delivered, and they were able to rent a public housing commission house not far from South Granville in Sefton, which is just at the other end of it. And they were very house proud. People in that street lived in fibro houses. They mowed their lawns, clipped their hedges. There were war widows and cab drivers and workers, and there was no sense of public housing being particularly impoverished or having social challenges. It was just a proud working class neighbourhood. Obviously, public housing changed over the years. It went from being housing predominantly for workers to increasingly being something that was targeted at people that had real challenges in their life, people with mental illnesses, single mums on very low incomes, and often very elderly people. But in its earlier days, Granville was a different type of place, and the fibro housing commissions of South Granville were wonderful housing. They really were where people were fleeing from what was seen as the impoverished and decaying and often diseased inner city, and people were embracing big yards and big lawns and lovely big hedges to clip, and it was a very, very much a happy place.